Okay. Hello, everybody. What a great week. Bible school, if you weren't involved, I hope you're praying. We had a great week. And, anyways, as we get into the passage for this week, Judges, we're getting into the book of Judges. Great book, great follow up to the studies in Joshua, where Joshua really emphasizes God's power and Israel's victory in many of the conquests. Now we're going to see the other side of the equation, and it's really a side that we can relate to. This cycle of obedience and then falling away a little bit, God bringing chastisement and deliverance, and then going back to disobedience. Sound familiar? It'll be familiar to you and to your students. So emphasize that cycle. Right at the beginning of understanding the context, about the third paragraph down, that is mentioned, and we see a reference to Judges 17:6, which is a key verse for this whole book. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did that which was right in his own eyes. Now, there was a king for Israel. That was God. And we'll talk about that in a few minutes when Samuel, the last judge, is presiding over Israel when they ask for a king. And I'll just throw it out there now. I'll give you the reference later so I don't have to turn the page. But God says to Samuel, they've not rejected you, they've rejected me from being their king. You see, in the book of Judges, God is their king. That was God had a very simple government, theocracy, meaning God is the king. And then the judges are his representatives. So there was a king available. They just didn't obey him. They didn't live for him. And then they wanted a king like all the other nations. That's getting ahead of the game a little bit, but I think it's important to understand. So I would emphasize this cycle. And you might want to throw out this discussion question. How do you see this cycle being evident in your life? You know, when Jesus isn't our king, when we don't put him first, which is a struggle we're going to have every day to do, then we are going to be like Israel, and we're going to fall into sin. And God, a lot of times, if we're not being sensitive to sin, has to bring us back to himself the hard way. And that's what we see happening in the book of Judges. I was just going to bring out some things. Keep in mind, as you look in page 92, in the second paragraph, it says, while it can be used in a positive context, it often carries a negative connotation that highlights the Israelites' tendency to turn their backs on God and his covenant. Remember that there are two covenants, and so when you see this reference to them turning their backs on God and his covenant, they're talking there about the Mosaic covenant, not the Abrahamic covenant. Don't ever confuse those two. They couldn't turn their back on the Abrahamic covenant in a sense because it was unconditional. It wasn't based on them. They turned their back on the Mosaic covenant, and that's why the negative things happen, but ultimately because of the Abrahamic covenant, God forgives them, and God keeps forgiving his people. He's going to bring them ultimately in the future to a complete salvation, obedience, and fulfillment of the inheritance of this land in the eternal kingdom. All right, so then there's a statement in the very next paragraph. Moses warned the people to avoid forgetting God and his ordinances. Ultimately, Joshua's death created a leadership vacuum. Now, this goes to what I've just said. This vacuum only existed because they were forsaking their ultimate king, which is God. And God gave them leaders. He gave them judges. If they had lived in obedience, they'd have more victory, but they didn't. So again, God didn't leave them in a vacuum in some sense that he abandoned them. They abandoned him, and that created the vacuum. Our sin always is the one who creates any kind of vacuum or hindrance. On the second column, down towards the end of it, it says the Lord sent the disaster he had promised. And other hostile groups attacked Israel. Without God's support, the Israelites could no longer resist their enemies. As a result, they suffered greatly. So I just kind of put in the margin of my notes, how do you see this happening today? How do we see God bringing chastisement even to the world through disasters and so forth? And of course, natural disasters are a part of it. It's not just bad weather. We can't judge when God is using natural disasters and so forth to bring judgment. We don't have that divine commentary, but he still does it today. Also, look at Romans 1:26 through 28. I'm not going to take the time to turn there and read it, but I really urge you to go to that passage, because on the other side of this, the other page, it says there's a discussion question towards the bottom. What factors contribute to a person or a group abandoning God? Well, Romans 1:28 and 29 gives you an answer, especially an answer for unbelievers and for the world, and what God does as a result of that. So look up those verses. They are very important. Next page, page 94. To protect and direct his wayward people, the Lord raised up judges. Okay, so I've already talked about this. This is in essence their representative for God, their king, if you will. So 1 Samuel 8:27 is the verse that I basically paraphrased a few minutes ago. So you definitely want to turn there. That's a key verse. It gives you kind of the end of this scenario in Judges. And you may not think of Samuel as being a judge, but he certainly was. He was the last judge. He was the judge that then God used to turn Israel over to the theocracy in the sense of a monarchy, starting with Saul, who didn't last very long as far as in any kind of obedience, although he was a king for about 14 years, and then David, and then the rest of them. But this rise and fall, again, goes to their rejection of God as their king. When you think of the cycle, how does this cycle, here's a discussion question, how does this cycle and God's eventual intervention, he continues to intervene and bring a judge that delivers them, how does that encourage you today? Great question you can ask your people. Just a few more things I'm going to bring out over on page 96. I've got written in the margin, the second column, and about the second paragraph and third paragraph, really. The second and third talks about how the Lord left these nations in the land. And then the third paragraph starts off with one possibility is that he wanted to prepare his people for the warfare to come. While that's legitimate, that's not the only reason. And I don't like the way they just emphasize this as God leaving them in the land, because it was both. God left the Canaanite nations in the land, but also it's because of their disobedience. They didn't drive out the people. And we see both the sovereignty of God, the providential God, whatever you want to call it, but God's actions and man's actions. Just like, for example, with Pharaoh, where Exodus 4:21 says that God hardened Pharaoh's heart. Exodus 7:13, God says Pharaoh's hardening his heart. And in this situation, if you go back to Judges chapter 1, verses 27 through 33, you see this constant emphasis of the different tribes that did not obey. They did not fully drive out the people out of the land. So don't just heavy emphasis on one. We've got to emphasize both, because even though we don't understand how our decisions and God's sovereignty mesh, and we're not robots, and yet God is in control, we'll never understand that, just like we don't understand the Trinity, but we don't want to fall on just one side, whether it be human responsibility or God's sovereignty. There's a balance, and it's a balance that I see often just not worked out in people's theology, not only in these contexts, but in the theology of salvation. So I hope these thoughts help. It's been a long week. We've got a lot of people in the hospital this week, so that kind of made the schedule a little bit tighter for study preparation, not to mention VBS. But I hope these thoughts help you, and hope to see you Sunday, and have a great rest of the day.